Hello, everyone. I'm over here on the Oregon coast. It's a little bit of a drippy day, but we actually need the moisture. So I'm going to get to run you through the marbled murrelet, some issues and opportunities. And so we've got a lot of visuals and some, I'll clue you into some controversial issues that some of us are dealing with. So I'll be a little overview dealing with terrestrial habitat issues. I'll introduce you to the important bird area program, which might be new for some of you, and talk about some of the challenges related to this uplisting to an endangered status and forest fragmentation edge effects. And since this unique seabird is actually connected not only to the health of the forest, but the health of the ocean, I'll be talking about habitat issues as well. Marine reserves, marine protected areas, and forage fish, prey base. And I'll go into recovery strategies as well, recovery planning strategy, things that I think we can and should be doing. So just to give you a quick little perspective on this little seabird, we're there on the central coast, but you can see it goes all the way to Alaska, breeding and at sea. So it's a species that is region Y in the California current. And of course, this gets you a perspective of what it used to look like. I have a few of these just to give you a little reality check of what the habitat looked like 150 years ago. And then, so this little seabird, again, not knowing any idea if you have any idea about the species, nests in old growth or mature forests and forages in the nearshore. And since it's a seabird, it actually dives down and swims for its prey. So it can go down to like 150 feet. And sorry about that. And swimming after its prey. And just the reality check is, the reality is we didn't even have a known nest site in Oregon and until 1990. And the graph on your left, you can see the, it's called number of birds per kilometer. And so that's from Marty Raphael's study. And so it's a density of birds per kilometer. And you can see from California, where there's almost none, to the hot spot on the central coast where we have the highest, and then you go up Puget Sound. So these are some hot spots that gives you an idea of core areas for conservation. And those habitat hotspots in the ocean, surprise, surprise, are linked to the habitat in the terrestrial side. And this actually, just a little quick backgrounder, not only I manage land for Audubon, but I used to work on the marbled murrelet research team. I was their climber, and I would gather data in the upper canopy. So here's a little quick test for you. If you look at this old growth tree, can you actually see the seabird in the nest? And I won't waste much time on it, but go to the top of the tree where it's branches, go to the right, and you'll see a small little window there. And that's actually a marbled murrelet at about 180 feet. And I'm the climber taking a photo, looking at this thing from about 200 feet away. So that's the first nest that the team, and that's Kim Nelson, OSU Wildlife Research Team, on the ground, and some of us in the canopy. But they breed along the West Coast, spends most of its life at sea, nested in old growth, federally listed in 92, state listed in 95, and listed as endangered in California, Washington. And that's one of the issues that we have to deal with in Oregon, is trying to get an uplisting strategy to get them designated as an endangered status, which will get us a recovery plan and a credible monitoring strategy, which is not happening right now. And then this is the landscape that I'm intimately engaged with. The sanctuary, the Audubon sanctuary that I manage, is basically over that second ridge and then 5 miles from the ocean. And that's the Audubon sanctuary. And I orchestrate conservation strategies with partners. Partners are Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, salmon recovery strategies, Sayusla National Forest, and the community on acquisitions, conservation easements, restoration strategies, a list of actions. And then we have this globally significant important bird area, IBA. So BirdLife International initiated that effort in the 80s, and then that's internationally. And anybody, a state, a conservation organization, a country can actually say, we'll take the lead on this. Well, Portland Audubon and National Audubon went in partnerships on identified important bird areas around the state. So we have about 100 of them around the state and about 30 of them on the coast. And it can be an important bird area or a hemispheric or important bird area or a globally significant IBA. We gathered the data with Kim Nelson, the crew, and forwarded it off to BirdLife International, and they designated this a globally significant important bird area. And again, it's dealing with the foraging area in the near shore as well as the terrestrial numbers of known occupied sites. And then the threats, of course, habitat loss, forest fragmentation, predation as a result of this fragmented landscape with due to corvids, not covids, crows, ravens, and jays, and then of course dealing with overfishing and oil spills and oceanic conditions and disease. So just to give you a little reality check, is here's a would be deemed a potential nest site, and if you look at the tree, that if you look at the butt of the tree, which you can't, or if you were there on the ground, it would be a 6 foot, 7 foot Douglas fir, and you go up to the top and you don't have a top. It blew out in a storm. My guess would be about 30 years ago. That branch that looks to be the top of that tree, that has a hormone change, and turns out that when you lose the top, those lateral branches change in and says, I'm going to be the leader. And it gets a lot of energy growing from the tree. And so that's a potential nesting platform. And so that's a perfect spot for a nest. This one is not an occupied tree, but it's an example. It's a really good, easy example to show you what one would be looking for in a native forest. These went through the fire on the Coast Range 150 years ago. And of course, the top got blown out on one of our good storm events. So, and then the marbled murrelet nesting habitat, they did a suitability analysis in the Coast Range. And as you can see, class 1 lowest up to class 4 highest quality habitat. So you go down the middle of the screen there, the map, and you'll see where that Cummins 10-mile block, Siuslaw National Forest, the green is. So it just drives home the value of the Siuslaw National Forest for the murrelet. But the reality of it is, it's for multiple species that are connected to that older forest conditions. You go further south, you can see the Elliott down there as well. So those are two core areas, and you go further north and you've got Drift Creek and Cascade Head, and further north you've got up in Clatsop National State Forest. So these are hot spots for the murrelet, but it's also multiple species as well. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And so again, then you've got some nearshore transects where folks Craig Strong out of Crescent City does these transects. I think it's every other year actually, or something like that. Well, they'll count birds on the water. And so here is the state of Oregon's birds on the in the transects. And you zero in again, and you can see that from the Central Coast, from Reedsport basically to Walport, Newport is the hotspot, and that's where most of the birds are, and that's where the Siuslaw National Forest is. And so this really is a conservation priority area. And then I'd like to draw attention to edge effects as a result of industrial landscape, and it actually is also the way we do our thinning on public lands. It's something that we need to deal with. But we're watching, you're seeing blowdown as a result of an adjacent clear cut. So that's public land unraveling. It's called edge effects as a result of blowdown from storm events. in a clear cut on private lands. And so if you look at that little to the bottom on the left, as you look at the screen, you'll see a Forest Service boundary marker. And so you can see those trees were standing when the cut went in, and now they're just falling over like dominoes now with every powerful storm we have from the southwest. And then oil spills is again one of the other issues that identified as a threat are these. So here you've got the new Carissa. Maybe some of you remember that event. Was very catastrophic event. Seabird die-off, oil slicks, things like that. Well, there was a mitigation package that went together, and almost 4,000 acres went to the Siletz tribe, with some of it being occupied stands, some of it being replacement stands, more of a plantation type thing that can be managed for profit to help pay for taxes and things. But, you know, I look at this new Carissa and that acreage of investments as a result of a damage. We should be looking at our bioregion more as a conservation strategy with multi-species approach. So it's kind of like, it's the new thing. It's the new strategy that we need to deal with. So for me on the Central Coast, I get to work with our partners, Siuslaw National Forest Service, and in this case, state parks. And so this is a state park, and they're using a laser imaging that actually can show and lead us in a direction about hotspots for the marbled murrelet. Those red that are in that northern block there, this is Beaver Creek south of Newport, and the dark green is the national forest, and this is private land. And when you do use this LiDAR data set, you actually can come up and query this age or size. And so red is 150 to 200 foot tall trees. And the closer it gets towards magenta or maroon is 200 plus. And knowing the parcel on the ground, ground truthing it, you got trees are in the 250 zone there. And the only reason they're there is it's a kind of like a remote, not easily accessible, so it wasn't taken the first time through. And then we were fortunate enough to get it on the docket under a Section 6, which is a murrelet recovery strategy, working with state parks and the community. Got the funding and secured that. And so we've got a strategy with a core area. Wetlands Conservancy owns part of that, has an easement actually on an occupied stand there as well. So this is how we're kind of piecing these parcels together. This is another way to look at it with these, and that is a BLM chunk, about a 40-acre piece. And so these are things that, this is what we've got to do, is piece the landscape back together with restoration, forestry, protection, and dealing with connectivity strategies. So this, again, the national forest, the Siuslaw is really going to be carrying the brunt for the murrelet and other species that depend on that older forest conditions. And they have, under the Northwest Forest Plan, basically 90, as you can see, 97% that's going to be managed as late successional and riparian reserve. And then of that 630 acres, 630,000 acres, about a third of it is a plantation. So we got the benefit of the trees, built houses, everything with it, and it's all been replanted, and now that's coming back online for management, which would be for late successional reserve. So a thinning regime to create old growth habitat for owls, murrelet, and other species. And some of that has already been commercially thinned. And so this is the process. And so we're working with the Forest Service on trying to get them to deal with a more conservative approach to their thinning regime. It's actually something that is in play right now. It is a challenge. And so, like you can see, the strategy, that this new direction, of course, the Siuslaw is a major producer, and now their mission is dealing with restoration, partnerships, and recreation. And so this thinning regime is somewhat controversial right now as a result of these information about the predation is so high that 70+% of these chicks get eaten. by edge species and some species that are in the interior forest, but the crows, ravens, and jays. So if you have a 30% on the right side, 30% canopy cover, you take out 70%, it's open. If you take out 40%, if you take out a set of trees and you leave 100 trees per acre, you know, so these are thinning processes and regimes. And so we've got to learn from the past, and the reality of it is the Forest Service, nobody has really grown marbled murrelet habitat. No one has really grown spotted owl habitat. So we're in a learning curve, and we have multiple species to deal with. Flying squirrels, also the marten, red tree vole. So the silvicultural practices for conservation is incredibly challenging these days. It isn't just we're going to grow trees fast. And so that is a challenge, and I urge you to help us on that effort. So then we get to talk about the ocean conservation strategy. I was on the Ocean Policy Advisory Council when this came to play. And so we have 5 spots: Cape Falcon, Cascade Head, Otter Rock, Cape Perpetua, and down at Redfish Rocks at Port Orford. And the Central Coast goes from north of Yachts to south of Heceta Head. That's the largest marine reserve, marine protected area in the state. Oh, this was, and this is related to the Elliott legal challenge. And I really appreciate Bob Salinger, Portland, and the team, Tanya, Noah, and Josh. But this is really what we're looking at, is this fragmented landscape. And now we get into kind of the reality check of what our industrial lands and some of our state lands look like. And this is public land, and this is the core areas for conservation, and they are at risk in many spots. And of course, roads, we didn't have information about unstable slopes. That's a new data layer we have. It's one of those controversial things. Dogami can step up and engage with national forests, state forest, and identify these unstable spots, decommission roads, and not have a failure like that or blow down like this. And we're not the only ones struggling with this. So down in California, they're doing the same thing. Have acquisition priority areas. They've got a wish list where they've actually identified protected areas, 100,000, targeted acquisition, 40,000. So this is what I'm saying is not radical. This is where we need to be going, is this landscape approach. And so it's where we need to go. And they, of course, deal with this, acknowledging the fact that these crows, ravens, and jays are very intelligent animals, and they'll have access to that edge habitat, and feeding them, they're smart enough to go in and go take the chick or an egg off the nest. Isn't it cute? That's a baby jay. And so understanding this change in habitat, edge effects, humans on the landscape, from there's a few long-term data sets, and you can see from 1900 to current conditions, these ravens and jays have just exploded. Oops. So there's a campaign to deal with this, educating our community, our campers out in the campgrounds, and we do these field trips and community science events in July, and you would be invited to that. Not sure if we'll actually get to do one this July, but we've been doing it for right at 15 years, and we've broken it up into 2 sessions because it's been so successful, because we have known occupied sites, and we can do an education night the night before. Folks camp out, and then we go to the spots in the morning, 4:45, do a survey, and then we come back to the viewing platform in yachts and do a at-sea survey and get to see birds on the water. And that's what you're looking for right there. Some folks describe it as the flying potatoes. Glenn got a great shot. Nice calm water. This is in Puget Sound, actually. But that's kind of what we're looking for. These trees made it through that Yaquina burn 150 years ago. They reseeded a burn landscape, and these are some of those hub trees, or the grandma and grandpa trees, what we call them. And those, you can see those potential nesting platforms like that. And that would be a nest cup. That's a fecal ring. And so basically that chick has just fledged, since the fecal ring is still nice and fresh. So this is a recently fledged nest. And so this is an example of when we do the nearshore surveys. Some days you're looking in the fog, and that's that maritime climate that pulls in the summertime. And so we thought we had a success, as some of you may know, with a uplisting to a endangered status at the state level. And they reneged on us and reversed that in the June meeting. This was last year. And so in any event, this is pretty frustrating. And so this is still in play. And I really appreciate all the legal expertise that has got that still in play. And we really need a recovery plan. We really need a monitoring strategy and a recovery plan. And so this is an example of the volunteers doing the Murrelet surveys in one of the July events. So now we get to talk about ocean issues and forage fish. So you can see these priority forage species for the Murrelet. It goes from juvenile rockfish to smelt, anchovy, sardine, sand lance, krill, and squid. And we don't really have a very good understanding on population size on those forage fish. Luckily, the conservation community, working with the other NGOs, took on that issue of forage fish. It took a number of years to deal with it in federal waters and a precautionary strategies in state waters. Really appreciate all of that effort as well. So when we think about these recovery planning efforts, you know, I look at it going, we got to talk about this by zone, and we're in zone 3, and you've got California, Oregon, Washington, then you get up to British Columbia. But for us, we should be thinking about it as a zone where we identify and prioritize by zone, and we have to deal with protection of these and creating large blocks of habitat, which would include acquisitions of some of the inholdings and a corvid management plan. The agencies have basically haven't put it on as a priority on their screen for state parks, and some of us have influenced local state parks through getting funding to actually do education in the campgrounds about crows, ravens, and jays. And so when we think about it, it's like, yes, we'd be dealing with the marbled murrelet recovery strategy, but you'd have amphibians, flying squirrels, and marten benefits as well when you have a landscape approach. Then you put the other overlay on it, which was that latest study that came out about the value of older forest in the Coast Range bioregion for carbon storage. So you'd be doing a carbon piece, large wood recruitment on unstable slopes, multi-species approach. So I think that this is the vision of where we need to go. And when we talk about it, you're talking about educational materials, funding sources for Section 6, which is a recovery funding strategy under the Endangered Species Recovery Strategies. And then, of course, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which has just gone into permanent status, which is kind of surprised last year. It was a bipartisan effort to put that in permanent. So that was really powerful. And then, of course, dealing with a regional database. So there's a list of actions that we need to be dealing, and some of these are in play, but can we do more? Yes, we can do more. And so in the ocean, we've got to talk about actually designating marine habitat as critical habitat under the Endangered Species Act. We've got efforts related to marine renewable energy out there and dealing with policy issues related to, like I said, forage fish management plans and this ecosystem-based approach. And so these are new things that we need to engage in, and some of us are, and we always need more help. So here's a little flyer, and we cross our fingers that we get to do a survey in July. You can see July 16th, 17th, and then 22nd, 23rd, if we're lucky, and do an education thing the night before, and everybody gets to pick where you're going to go in the morning at sunrise and go look for birds in the forest. And we'll have Kim speak in the evening and myself, and divide up into multiple teams, and if we're lucky, and go out. So it's a question mark right now, to be honest, if we'll actually have a field trip in July. But hopefully that can happen. And then, so this is a backgrounder of videos, materials, and I thought maybe we would end up doing a 4-minute video by an OSU production, but we can send that out to you and make sure that you get access to some of these videos. And OSU has this science and arts program now out of the Marine Science Center, and Rachel did a very good job on this little video short. And then, so there's a number of things. And of course, if you're looking for a good a good book, Rare Bird by Maria Ruth Mudd is excellent. And then backgrounders on Portland Audubon's website and ODFW's, and OPB's got a video that's actually really old, but it's actually pretty cool. And so in any event, that's where we are right now. Really appreciate that you all jumped on board on this, and let's pass that over to Danielle.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate that. Great. So now we're going to jump into my presentation. Yeah, thanks again, Paul. That was really wonderful, and I think a great deep dive into on-the-ground efforts and restoration that's happening. And like you said, I think that's right, that these sort of zone landscape-wide restoration programs and protection measures really need to be the sort of driving force, instead of having species by species, but really looking at the whole ecosystem, I think is really great. So anyway, thanks for highlighting that. So I'm going to go through sort of the advocacy side of this now. I'm going to probably take it a step back and go to more the 10,000 foot level, both from Oregon Wild's wildlife work and then into the specific asks and actions that you can take today, leaving this webinar. So again, I'm the wildlife program coordinator, and just to give you all a recap, especially for those who've perhaps been on one of our webcasts so far, bear with me, this might be a review again, but for those who haven't, I just want to share with you sort of Oregon Wild's approach to, you know, how do we choose which species we work on? Because there are obviously so many in Oregon and we care about them all, but I'm only one person and I have limited capacity. So, you know, we sort of break it into these conservation of the keystones, right? So these species that are particularly significant in the ecosystem. Without them, you tend to see collapse. And so I have what I deem as ecological keystone species, political keystone species, and social keystone species. And obviously the ecological, I'm sure, is the version of a keystone species that most people know about. And again, different species can fit into all three categories, but this is sort of the lens by which I look at our work. Then you have political keystone species. So these are species, and I put the marbled murrelet and northern spotted owl in this camp, you know, by way of protecting this species or seeking protections. It sort of opens the door to talk about larger issues that affect that species. So again, when it's related to marbled murrelet and northern spotted owl, we're obviously end up talking a lot about protection of old growth forest and just general forest management. So they often are politically contentious species, but ones that are really important to sort of anchor conversations that need to be had around restoration, again, about our extractive industry practices. So I see the marbled murrelet and again, northern spotted owl to fit into that. And then you have social keystone species. And quite honestly, in some ways, I find this to be one of the most important keystone species, because it's those species that get people excited and wanting to be advocates and activists and want to engage in the political process, because without people and the public, you know, having that engagement, it's hard for individual advocates like myself to really carry forward these issues and for us to see measures put in place to protect these different animals. So, there are certain people, probably like Paul Engelmeyer, that, would get out of bed and go to a rally for the red treble. Not everybody's that way. However, wolves, sea otters, beavers, California condors, these tend to be species that have a lot of social excitement and pull. So that's sort of how I break up and think about the lens of my work. And again, a lot of them hit all three, but I just want to give that overview. So as to you maybe thinking, why or why not does Oregon Wild do X, Y, or Z when it comes to wildlife? So if there's anything if there's going to be any theme from this particular webcast, it's going to be, again, about that advocacy. And I think you all saw the title of this particular event, but it's, I'm a paid lobbyist or advocate or whatever you want to call me, and I care about these issues. But at the end of the day, me going to the legislature, me going in front of the Fish and Wildlife Commission, it carries some weight, but really the emphasis and how we get things across the finish line is through that grassroots action. It's the power in numbers. It's people like you speaking out, speaking up. It's those public comments going in. So these are the things that really make the difference for what happens to our wildlife in Oregon. So I can't stress this enough. If you walk away from this webcast thinking anything, it's I've got to take action. I've got to do something to make sure that the knowledge I'm gaining on these webcasts, I'm turning into engagement. So here's a little bit of a roadmap for particular wildlife advocacy. These are the spaces, these are the decision makers that are the most influential when it comes to the state's wildlife. So you obviously have the Oregon legislature in Salem. The one that I think gets talked about the least, although I feel like I'm doing my part to try to broadcast it, is the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission. This is really the premier decision-making body who determines what's going to happen on a whole host of things. You obviously have U.S. Congress, so our federal government, and then of course the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which makes decisions and all the rules and regulations related to the Endangered Species Act federally. And then again, and sorry if this is a recap for folks and you're like, Danielle, this is old hat, why do we have to see this? But I think it's important just to remind ourselves of the things that you can be doing that are extremely effective tools. So, calling your elected official, even if you're timid to want to talk to a person on the phone, call after hours and leave a voicemail, but just making sure that your voice is heard. Attend a town hall when an elected official, be it federal or at the state level or local, is having a town hall. Go try to ask a question. Submitting a comment, that sounds pretty broad, but I mean it more in the sort of regulatory side of in front of the Fish and Wildlife Commission. Again, whether there's a comment period for an Endangered Species Act protection consideration for a particular species. So, making sure that you do a written comment. And then probably just as important as all these is sharing these actions on social media, because again, it's that power of harnessing the grassroots. So sharing actions on social media, texting people, whatever it is, but making sure that when it's an issue you care about, that we're telling as many people as possible. Continuing to write letters to the editor. I think it's important. I still get the Oregonian and read it. Me and my boys read it every day. So, it's still an important way to communicate. And then finally, testifying, which even when I wrote this presentation, I was like, what's another word for testifying? It just sounds so, I don't know, like serious or I can't testify, but we just mean attending a public hearing and giving, oral comments on a particular matter. So that's really important. And I think, again, I just want to emphasize that it's effective. So some of the issues happening now, and again, as Erin had mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to kind of talk about a bunch of things that are happening around wildlife and their habitat that you could be doing. And then I'm going to go into the marbled murrelet specifically. So again, bullet one, marbled murrelet under consideration for these endangered protections. I'll dive into that in a moment. There's going to be a proposal soon to ban beaver trapping on all federal public lands. So stay tuned on that. That's coming up in June in front of the Fish and Wildlife Commission. We have something I find particularly exciting is a highly endangered species. In fact, the first species on the endangered species list, the California condor. They're doing a release in Northern California on Yurok territory and in the Redwood National Park. And just given the range for this bird, it flies, up to 100 miles in one day. That release in Northern California could mean the California condor is in Oregon that day or the next day. So that's really exciting to think about the return of a native species back to Oregon. So there's a lot happening in that realm. And actually, we're doing a webcast in 2 weeks about the California condor, where we'll be joined with Yurok tribe member Tiana Williams-Clausen, who is also their wildlife department director, and she's going to talk all about the California condor. So you don't want to miss that one. It's going to be amazing. And then another thing happening in the world of wildlife was with sea otters. So for those who don't know, they were once abundant in Oregon a long time ago and were, essentially wiped out. And so while there are populations in Washington and California, there are no sea otters, there are no resident sea otters off of the Oregon coast. So there's a lot of work being done right now, research and just, trying to determine, is it feasible to reintroduce sea otters to the Oregon coast? So stay tuned again for that, because there'll be a lot of opportunity to weigh in the coming months and years. And then, there's not much to do on this, but I did just want to flag for folks that in the world of wolves, we're waiting for the final rule to come out on removing wolves from the federal endangered species list. And so, it's sort of piecemealed, where there's protections for wolves, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a year ago, proposed just removing the remaining protections. And so we're kind of waiting for that to be finalized. So we'll see. And then finally, and I can't stress this really enough, because it's kind of the crux of all of this, which is, who's going to be on this Fish and Wildlife Commission? We can do and make the best arguments on all these different issues, but if we don't have, really solid people who respect science, who care about the broad public values on our commission, then it's just always going to be an uphill battle. So we have another round of appointments to the Fish and Wildlife Commission coming up this summer. So again, stay tuned for opportunities to weigh in with your state senator, and more. And then in relationship to habitat, and I think Paul mentioned this briefly, but I'm sure many of you know of sort of the history around the Elliott State Forest and attempts by the governor and others to sell off the Elliott State Forest to the highest bidder. Really challenging, especially given that it's, has some prime marbled murrelet habitat. So there's a lot of efforts underway, have been for years, to both develop habitat conservation plan and also just determine what's going to be the strategy for maintaining the Elliott State Forest going forward. I will say that groups like Portland Audubon are the lead on that particular effort. Oregon Wild plays a little bit more of a background role in that particular issue. Recently, the Rocky Habitat Management Strategy was updated, and the reason this is particularly interesting for us is just given the potential to reintroduce sea otters to the nearshore environments. That rocky habitat is extremely important. So we submitted comments, and again, it's just something that we did in order to, again, look at that wider landscape approach or seascape approach to protecting habitat as it relates to a variety of species. And then finally, there's a proposal being put forward by Senator Wyden and others in Congress to really expand the rivers and streams in Oregon as for their designation as wild and scenic. So it's one of the highest levels of designation, just under wilderness. And in addition to the actual river segment that would be designated, there is buffers, around the river area. And so it's extremely beneficial for a whole host of species. So that's a lot I just threw at you. And, if you can take a screenshot, or if I'll put my email address up if you want more on any one of these, I'm happy to send it to you. The other thing I would say is, if you're not already on Oregon Wild's email listserv, I highly encourage you to sign up, because we send out, of course, alerts and updates on these particular issues as things become more timely. And then there's another sub list, I guess we'd call it, which is called the Wolf Pack. And it's not just for wolf issues, but it's about wildlife broadly. And I send out a newsletter, Wolfpack newsletter, just once a month, so the email traffic's really low on it. But I think it's really beneficial if you do care about wildlife and their habitat, because that's where you get a much more comprehensive download. Here's action items, here's events coming up, all related to wildlife. So that's the Wolfpack newsletter, and you can send me an email or you can find it on our website to sign up for it. So now to our featured creature, the marbled murrelet. So Paul touched on this a little bit. I'm going to go into a little bit of a deeper dive on the history of seeking, more protections for the marbled murrelet, and then go into what can you do? You hang up from this webcast, what's something you could do out the gate today? So as he said, in 1995, the bird was listed as threatened under the Oregon Endangered Species Act. It just missed the cutoff, I think, by like weeks, for when it was mandated that you had to do a recovery plan or a management plan for that species. And so it's kind of silly, because even though they missed it by weeks, apparently ODF&W said, well, okay, then we still just won't do one, which really shouldn't have been a rubber stamp to not do a management plan, but they should have said, oh, well, even though we only missed it by a few weeks from a government mandate, maybe we should still think about doing one. But they didn't. And so, we see this decline in their population and in their trajectory over, however many, 20 years. So in 2017, groups like Oregon Wild, Portland Audubon, Cascadia Wildlands, Center for Biological Diversity, Defenders of Wildlife filed a petition to list the marbled murrelet from threatened up to endangered. So that's what Paul was referencing when we say uplisted, because threatened, endangered, I guess, that's higher, so we say up. And what that did is it triggered the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to conduct, or to put together research related to the marbled murrelet. So what is the status of this species in the state? If we're going to consider moving it from threatened to endangered, we should probably know how it's faring. So ODFW put together this biological status review. In fact, it was pretty well done. We had other scientists from Oregon State University, and Paul probably looked at it, and it was for all intents and purposes a pretty well done report. And so in February of 2018, the commission approved our petition, which means that they uplisted the species. They said, yep, based on this report, based on public comment that we've received, this species warrants endangered species protection. So yay, victory, we celebrated. And then in June, the commission was supposed to, so before you develop a management plan, what they do is they adopt survival guidelines, and it's sort of a stopgap measure between the listing and between the actual development of a management plan, just to ensure the survivability of the species. So it's just, hey, what are some provisions we can put in place to make sure we don't see further decline while we develop the management plan? So in June of 2018, the commission was supposed to just be finalizing the survival guidelines. But instead, because the commission's chair does have some discretion, decided to sort of reopen the case of whether this should be listed as endangered. And, we all speculate that this is because they got a ton of pressure from the logging industry and from county commissioners and other folks along the coast. And so at the June hearing in 2018, pretty much out of nowhere, they reversed their decision. And so promptly following, groups like Oregon Wild, Portland Audubon, again, many of the same petitioners filed a lawsuit, both from the substance standpoint of this meets, this warrants protection as met by science, but also because it's illegal to do that. I mean, from an administrative standpoint, you can't just kind of out of nowhere reverse a decision without a scientific or legal justification. And so we knew that once that, when they did that and when we filed, it was unprecedented, and we knew that they were going to be in some trouble, because you have to give proper public notification. You have to, you have to follow all these administrative procedures. So anyway, we filed that lawsuit. We won in September of 2019. And they just ruled on the merits of again, the administrative procedure side of it. They didn't weigh in on the substance side. The court said it's not really up to them. They don't know the science, so what they did is they said, yeah, commission, you acted illegally. You're not allowed to do that without proper justification. So now it goes back to the commission to either justify their what you would call re-downlisting, or to just affirm their previous decision, which was to list the species as endangered. So that's where we are. And I know that was a lot. I just wanted to give you some of the context, because this has been a very, in what Aaron had mentioned, a contentious issue, but it has been quite controversial, the species. And again, as you can tell from uplisting, oh, never mind, the timber industry put too much pressure on us, we're going to reverse our decision. So it's becoming a really important issue, though, to showcase that the commission, cares about science, respects the law. And so there's a lot kind of weighing on this particular issue. So what can you do? Well, we need your voice. So like I said, this has been now on remand from the circuit court. This is going back to the commission. And so they are deciding whether or not to, again, uplist the species to endangered or justify keeping it at threatened. And so we, of course, are encouraging the commission to change its designation to endangered. And I think, to what Paul said, it's just, without that, we really need that endangered species management plan. We need the recovery plan, and this will really trigger that process and ensure the survivability of the species. So if there's nothing else, again, that you walk away with today, I would say submitting a comment. You can do it there, odfw.commission@state.or.us. And I'll give you some pointers about what you should say, but I'll preface it by saying that, anytime you're submitting comments, I would say, stick to what what you feel comfortable saying. I think we all have the tendency to go, oh my gosh, I've got to make every legal and scientific argument. But if you don't necessarily have that expertise, it can be challenging. So don't feel overwhelmed by it. Even public comments, just going into the commission saying, I've been following this process, and, we really think that this is important for the future of the species and for the forest. And, you can keep it really broad to just, kind of the heart versus the head. But here are some suggested talking points anyway. And again, to some of that, the more specific things you can say is that, we look to the Fish and Wildlife Commission to uphold and reflect best available science when making determinations for the state's imperiled species. I do have deep dives on the science for the marbled murrelet. I'm sure Paul does as well. So if you are interested in really diving in deep on all of that, feel free to email me and I can send you additional stuff. But I think these are some helpful suggested talking points, because one of the things is that a lot of the commissioners that are now on the commission weren't there when this decision was made. So you sort of have, we're kind of caught between a changing of the guard, as it were. And so some of this is trying to get those folks up to speed and for them to see that this is an issue that people care about. So I say all of that to say, again, if you don't have the scientific expertise, or you feel uncomfortable maybe to speak to that, don't stress about it. We have experts going to weigh in on that end. But I think what's important is that these new commissioners see that this is something that's really important to us, and that they feel an overwhelming sense of, oh my gosh, like the public's really paying attention to this issue, because we do not want this to just be something they kind of sweep under the rug and, make a terrible decision and just hope nobody sees it. And so I think your public comment is a way to at least say, without being threatening, like, we're watching you. So that's pretty much where I'm going to leave it. But again, if nothing else, and I know it all varies for everybody, what you're working from home, or your life under kind of in the time of COVID-19, what it's like. But assuming you might have a little bit more time to dive into this and to submit a public comment to the ODFW Commission, I highly encourage you to do that, because I can't emphasize enough how important having all of your voices weigh in is for change and for practicing conservation of our species. So I think we're going to turn it back to Erin for questions. But again, that's my email. If you have more questions about any of those other wildlife or habitat proposals and plans that are coming up, please let me know. But otherwise, I'm going to leave it there.
Thanks, Danielle. I don't know about everybody else, but your screen is frozen for me.
I see that. Let me.
Try turning off your webcam and turn it back on. Okay, we have some great questions here for you, Paul. What is or is there an optimal thinning regime in terms of timber for murrelets? Or is that still being investigated?
I guess the first thing, excuse me, the first thing would be, how close are you, or is the operation, to an occupied stand? So that's the first thing. The Marble Murrelet Recovery Plan in '97 gave a clear direction about having a buffer anywhere from 300 to 600 feet where you keep a closed canopy. So under their normal thinning regime of growing trees fast, the idea of saying we're going to take 60% out, the trees will grow older forest conditions quicker, but then those edge species have access to that. So that would be something that I would not do. And I'm trying to get the Forest Service to change that thinning mindset adjacent to occupied stand and follow the murrelet habitat. So as you get into more of a fragmented, smaller interior forest habitat conditions, it would give you free up other options to do that. More aggressive thinning was the way I would describe it. So I would keep it as closed canopy as you can, adjacent to the occupied stand, depending on the topography, 300 to 600 feet, the equivalent of a screen as a buffer. It's a little bit of a long answer.
I want to put in a plug. Mallory put in this comment, less of a question. It's that another very effective way to take action is to vote. So everybody remember to get your ballots in. If you're in Oregon, we have mail-in voting, which is great. If you're in another state, hopefully you'll be able to exercise your right, or you already have. But that's very, very important in terms of electing people who are going to be champions for wildlife and speak up for them. Speaking of people out of state, Danielle, what would you say is, how much does ODFW consider comments from out of state residents?
Interesting. I don't know. I haven't really asked ODFW or their commission specifically to that. I mean, I know when it comes to the legislature, they for sure are tracking and generally only want comments from their constituents. But I think, when it's usually a statewide issue, I don't think they follow that as closely. So I would say that you could still do it. Again, I don't know if they say, oh, this person's from Idaho, great, we're not going to listen to them. But I think at the very least, it's worth having another comment in to show that people are paying attention to this, even from other states. So, and I think, sorry, one more thought about that. I mean, I think that's good because, obviously Oregon has this green reputation and, we're seen as a leader on a lot of these issues. I would say on wildlife, it's not always the case, but it's just helpful to have more eyes on the issue to say, hey, we're tracking this even from afar. So.
Can I answer that? Am I on?
Yep.
Well, I think that one thing that we need to kind of acknowledge is the fact that there are non-consumptive wildlife users out there. Whether you're from Oregon, Pendleton, or Sandpoint, Idaho, or California, you're coming to Oregon and you are spending money. You are a force. Tourism is a force, will continue to be a force, and your voice should be heard. So I deal with people from all over the world on the coast, and they're here and they're a part of our landscape.
Good point. Mm-hmm.
Danielle, what's the timeline for getting in comments to the commission?
Yeah, that's a good question.
What meeting will that be considered at?
Yeah, thanks for that reminder. I think I was trying to wrap it up at the end and realized I forgot. So in response to the court decision, they were actually supposed to make the decision by July 1st of 2020, but because of just, again, some of the challenges around COVID and not really knowing if the commission was going to be prepared to do a really intense virtual hearing, we actually asked for an extension, we as the petitioners, and it was granted. So they have to make their decision by November. So we expect that it will come up in September or October. But one of the reasons I'm trying to highlight it now is just, again, to this assumption perhaps that people are at home, maybe looking for something to do. This gives you some time to maybe dive into writing a longer form comment. So you have time, but I would still urge you to do now. And if you ever wanted to, you know, add on to it, you can always submit another comment. But I think the commission receiving a steady drumbeat of comments, even now up until September, until the decision, I think is really important to show, again, that like the public's paying attention and we care about this issue. So till November is to answer your question.
A couple of questions are on the resources. There's an automatic follow-up email that GoToWebinar, the platform we're all on, that'll send out tomorrow. Included in that, in addition to a link to this recorded video, I'm going to be including contact information for Paul and Danielle to answer some of these as follow-up questions, but also PDFs of some of the slides that they had so that people can reference those offline. I know that not everybody can click the links when they're in a live presentation, so making sure that everybody has access to those. Here's an interesting question, Paul, for you. Is there any problem with harbor seals eating forage fish? This person had been on another webcast and they said that there's a shortage of forage fish and that harbor seals were the main, it was part of the main diet of harbor seals. Are they competing for the same food source?
Where is this? Did they say over in California, Oregon, Puget Sound? Did they say that?
It wasn't part of the comment.
Okay. Well, forage fish, as I mentioned, the agency really doesn't have a handle on population as well as distribution of some of these forage fish. So as an example, just 2 weeks ago, a retired U.S. Fish and Wildlife sent out a beautiful set of photos related to sole or Dover sole or perch, excuse me, sea perch, being eaten in Alsea Bay. And he has never seen anything like it. I forwarded it to someone else. They said 40 years here, we've never seen anything like it. So it's, again, an example of, there's a number of data gaps out there related to forage fish and prey base.
It was Puget Sound. Jennifer followed up.
Okay.
Danielle, and maybe this will be the last question because we're getting past 7 o'clock. Danielle, what is the most endangered species? This is from a third grader. The most endangered animal that Oregon Wild is focused on.
Oh my gosh, you might have stumped me. The most endangered. Oh, I know. Well, I guess I'm thinking, sorry, now my brain is, there's a lot of endangered species that were once here that aren't here that should be, like sea otters and condors, but I was thinking purely on numbers in Oregon. It's probably the wolverine. We only
Wolverine,
yeah. Yeah, but they're not even in what? That's a whole nother that's a whole nother comment. But yeah, probably the wolverine. There's only one known wolverine in the state, Stormy in the Wallowas.
Okay, well, we'll wrap that up. Again, I'll send out contact information for both of you to everybody who's watched this. That should go out tomorrow so people can send in follow-up questions, and we'll have a bunch more information on that. And with that, thanks everyone for attending this. This is really important, talking about our native species and then how we can make a difference in protecting them. It's incredibly important. And thank you all for attending. And thank you, Paul and Danielle.
Yeah, thank you, Paul.
Thank you, guys.
Have a good one.